Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome back. My name's Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Managing Director at AHURI. We've had a fascinating morning, a really broad-ranging discussion, and we have another fantastic panel for you this afternoon in that always challenging after-lunch session. So we're going to try and keep it a little bit lively, try and keep you all awake as you digest both the morning's discussions and the lunch. As we've heard this morning, meaningful decarbonisation will require major shifts in practice and materials and thoughtful design for the occupants. Success depends on buy-in across all levels of government, private industry and education and training institutions. So this session will discuss the opportunities and the challenges in building the housing sector's capacity and capability to meet the scale of change needed. If we imagine the sector of the future, constructing homes with low embodied carbon at every stage of the home's life cycle, from design and construction through occupancy and through to demolition and reuse, what would it look like? Joining our session today, we have Anne Austin, Head of Sustainability at Lendlease, Julia Halioua, Associate at the Footprint Company, Cathy Inglis, Group CEO of Think Brick, and Carrie Hamilton, an Industry Advisor. We're going to hear from each of the panellists, then we'll open up for audience conversation. So to get started, I'd like to invite Anne Austin to start today's session.
Thank you for starting the applause down the front. Yes, so I was asked to come and talk about circularity initially, and one of the things that I spoke to Susanna and the organisation about was the fact that probably the journey that we've been on in my organisation at Lendlease has lent more into the decarbonisation space, and these two agendas are inextricably linked. One of the ways that we will achieve our decarbonisation targets is circularity. And so the organisers then asked if I could talk a little bit to the work that we have been doing in that space. So that's the context in which I'm talking to you about today, and I'm actually going to lean right in particularly to embodied carbon. So magic worked. Those of you who are unfamiliar with Lendlease, we're an international company listed in Australia. We work in the real estate space over three areas, construction, development and investment management. So we have assets that we own and operate, as well as building for third-party organisations. In terms of housing, which is the agenda item on the table today, we do not play in the domestic scale. We have had in the past a communities business, but that was just a land business. So my context is coming more from an apartments scale, where we have had quite a considerable history in build-to-sell apartments and now more in the build-to-rent. We've got 2 build-to-rent apartments that are under construction at the moment. So that's a bit of context. Here's the other context. We've set ourselves some very bold carbon ambitions. We're a 1.5 degree aligned company. We've got science-based targets. We've got one that hits next financial year to be net zero in our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we're reducing them as much as possible and then offsetting the remainder. And then the big one, 2040, we're targeting what we're calling absolute zero for scopes 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And we're trying to do that without the use of offsets. So this is trying to lean into as much as possible the eradication of emissions. Now these are targets, and you know whether we'll get to absolute zero by 2040, we will know in 2040. We have had experiences in the past where we've set targets without knowing fully the journey and actually managed to exceed them. That might be our journey for this absolute zero one. But regardless, we're thinking if we set the target at zero, we're a lot more likely to get closer to it than if we set it at a certain reduction level. So under that context, we have been looking at sort of 5 key things that we need to do to decarbonise in the context of the real estate sort of business that we run. We've broken these up into scopes. The first 2 are around our scope 1 emissions, so think about the fuels that you burn. So in the context of construction, that's fuels that we burn actually on site, diggers, trucks, blah, blah. And then in a building, gas to heat the hot water and the cooling systems. So here we have to look for ways to design and build with zero reliance on fossil fuels. So we've been experimenting with different types of electric kit. We've been experimenting with fuel alternatives, things like renewable diesel, etc. And then the second item there, removing fossil fuel from existing buildings and operations. So we have to go through all of our buildings that have got gas in them now and map a pathway to replace that gas with heat pumps and the like so that they can be fully electrified. And so that will apply for all our build-to-rent buildings, etc. now that we're building, fully electric from day one. So it's sort of new, for the newer stuff coming in, we can set that pathway to decarbonisation much more easily, but we've also got to remember the existing stock, and that's a very relevant story generally in the terms of circularity, because existing stock is something that we need to love and cuddle, as we'll get to later for number 4 if we're thinking circular. Number 3 is actually the easiest on our Mission Zero, as we like to call it, journey, which is the generation and use of renewable electricity. There are, solutions out there. We're just about to enter a deal with a number of different PPAs in different states that will see us 100% renewably powered in the next financial year. So that one, I think, once you can figure out your data and what you need, that one's fairly clear. So enter the two tougher ones, which are our Scope 3. So remember, everybody's Scope 3 is a bit different depending on which goggles you wear. So these are the things that we influence. So we influence up front, before we get onto site, the building materials. So we need to look at ways to design and specify that reduce embodied carbon. I'll deep dive into that in a minute. And then downstream, when we've got people using our buildings, which at the moment are predominantly commercial tenants, but in the build-to-rent context will start to be residential tenants, then we need to be encouraging them to be using and purchasing renewable electricity and being as efficient as possible. So let's deep dive into this one, though, in the context of circularity for you guys. So I just thought it'd be useful to talk to a little bit about why embodied carbon matters in the built form. There's been lots of conversation around the amount of electricity buildings consume, the amount of energy, the emissions associated with that. That's been a very large story, and it accounts for an enormous proportion of the world's emissions. And so you might sort of say, well, why do we, shouldn't we try and solve that first? Isn't efficiency and renewables the whole story? And it is a very big part of the story, but it's not the whole story. So I've got just a little illustration here, and I'm going to say this is an illustration based on looking at all the different sources of emissions across the world. So I want you to have a look at the blue, sort of royal blue bar that says 28% buildings there. That's the emissions associated with running a building. So at the moment, the lights are on, the air conditioning's on, the power to run those is that blue bar for all the buildings all around the world. But that's only a part of the story when it comes to built form. So the extension of that, you can see the little illustrative bar below where we've extended it to the left and the right. If we account for the actual building materials in their manufacturing stage and the carbon that's produced in manufacturing steel, cement, basically everything, even timber, all of it has an embodied carbon profile. And then you account for transporting it to and from your site. You start to get an entirely different picture about how many emissions the built form is responsible for, and it in fact becomes the largest contributor to carbon emissions in our world. The thing to remember is that the royal blue bar is going to shrink. As the grid becomes greener, we will start to see proportionally the upfront carbon from building materials play a much, much bigger role in the contribution that the built form makes to climate change. And that's one of the reasons that we're really passionate about looking at embodied carbon, because we can see a pathway to reducing the blue bar, but the pathway to reducing the embodied carbon story is a lot harder. And we need to start thinking about it now. And one of the ways to think about that is to consider circularity. So let's have a little look. Oh, I did have something that would have made that more helpful. There you go, I forgot. All right, so just in terms of the sort of work that we do, let's give you a sense of the kinds of things that we have to think about if we are going to start to lean into that embodied carbon space. So this diagram is specific to Lendlease's context. So somebody else, they'll circle different boxes. These are our Scope 3, sources of Scope 3 emissions. They together account for about 94% of Lendlease's emissions. So a huge proportion comes from the things that we influence as opposed to the things we control. So up front you can see this is the little truck, you know, in the factory, etc. That's what I was talking about manufacturing the materials and bringing them to our sites. For us, building is actually part of our Scope 1 because we are a builder. For other people, that may not be the case. And then downstream, there we are in the usage phase. So that all looks very simple, like, hey, just change your materials, hey? Well, let's have a little look at what they are. So in this diagram here, you can see that most of the materials are sitting in the structure. So 39% steel, 35% concrete and cement, 10% aluminium and glass. Those things tend to be the structure and the shell of the building. So this is where this is the stuff that we need to lean into and work out, well, what alternatives do we have to using those materials? So we've been working heavily on with an organisation called MECLA. We're one of the early founders of it, the Material Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, coming together with suppliers. Many of my friends from MECLA are here on the platform with me. Suppliers, designers, consultants, clients, etc. Everybody coming together to work out how can we resolve this. There are probably sort of 4 key challenges that we face when it comes to building materials and reducing their carbon footprint. The first is the most basic, which is the ask has been inconsistent. So we've had certain, let's say government departments, there'll be certain agencies asking for reduction in embodied carbon and others not asking for anything. Similarly in the private sector. And so from a supplier's perspective, that's really mixed signals. Like, is there any reason for them to retool, to innovate, etc.? Is this real or is this inconsistent? So MECLA, we've been trying to say, make sure everybody is asking for a reduction in embodied carbon all the time. And so if any of you are in the space of asking for housing, embodied carbon reduction should be one of the things that's core and central to your ask. The other challenges we have, I mean, I think probably everybody would guess, financing, so being able to finance retooling things. So, you know, if you've got a steel factory, it takes a lot of, you know, financial investment to remove a blast furnace and put in an electric arc furnace, for example. But perhaps also people underestimate the amount of advancement that we actually need in the technology and the chemistry. So some of the materials, like cement, as you manufacture it, just chemically it actually releases carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So sometimes it's not as simple as saying, well, can we swap that for this? Because we're still trying to work out what do we swap it for? And that all involves time, which is that sort of 4th challenge that we've been dealing with. Often the poor supply chain get called in at the last minute with 3 weeks to tender for this fabulous, you know, affordable housing tower that's needed instantly. And there's a ribbon cutting ceremony on this sort of date and and it doesn't give them enough time to explore alternative sources of materials that could go into their own product, which might reduce embodied carbon. So that's the kind of materials front, but I think even more relevant for this context around circularity is the design space. So another opportunity for us to reduce embodied carbon is to look at the world of design. And the first question for design is, do you need a new building at all, or can you repurpose an old one? And you'll see why I say that when you look at some of these slides I've borrowed from friends in Atelier 10, who've done some fantastic work in trying to articulate for us where most of the carbon sits. So again, it's sitting predominantly, you know, the same sort of diagram that we showed for Lendlease in the substructure and the superstructure, so one being below the ground, the basements, etc. So if we can make changes to the type of structure we have and the number of floors in the basement, we can actually make massive savings in embodied carbon. And so they've given us a few clues on some of the things that we can do and avoid. And a lot of them are not that popular. So if you look at that superstructure there, the first dot point, a smaller grid, that means a smaller column grid i.e. more columns. Now that might sound counterintuitive, but if you've got a big span, you've got to have some hulking transfer beam that sits on top of those, that big span. So there's actually less concrete overall if we've got more columns. Now we've been on a journey in the last decade to say big and expansive, and floors need to be open, etc. In the context of residential though, there's lots of opportunity to lean into this one because there's lots of walls in homes and houses. This is probably more of a challenge in the commercial context. But there are some other things in there around, retaining as much as possible. So if we can keep a structure, strip it out, lots of talk at the moment. We're looking at this absolutely of repurposing commercial buildings that are perhaps underutilised, old, gas, etc. Can you electrify them? Can you either turn them into new commercial or new housing? And can you do that with keeping the structure? That will go a huge way to reducing embodied carbon. And that's an ultimate in circularity, in terms of extending the life of a product. Things like fewer lifts, more stairs, making things simple in terms of your services, etc. But I thought I'd pull out a few examples that I found particularly interesting when we started to look into this. So this is the column one. So the one on the bottom actually has a 20% saving in embodied carbon when you start to put in those small columns. And they've tried to show the sort of, Frank Lloyd Wright version of columns there to prove that it can be sexy and have lots of columns in space. That's in Wisconsin. That goes back to my architectural roots. I remember at uni salivating over things like that. And however, some of the other things that we used to salivate over, we have to stop salivating over. Does anybody know where this building? Singapore, right? It's wild, that thing. It's got like this crazy swimming pool and stuff on the top. So totally cool, great for tourism. Lots of people come in there. But this little baby would have the most incredible embodied carbon footprint just to be able to be hanging out over there. And so here's another example just to show you. So this is a building in Sydney here, and this one, the council were particularly keen on having sight lines, like, okay, we want to be able to keep that space open. So they said, can you cantilever, can you hang out, which is similar to the Singapore thing. So in that one, that's where it says STR transfer, to be able to have that cantilever, they've had to put all the steel reinforcement going into that. They've had to put as much steel and concrete as there would be in 20 floors into one to be able to do that and to hang that over. So these are things that, when I studied architecture, cantilevers were in the good bucket. Whoa, that's cool, that's great. We are going to have to relearn what's cool and what's great. That is ludicrous. And I reckon if we'd have gone back to council, at that point and said, do you realise what is required for those sight lines, perhaps a different decision might have been made. And I think that this is the challenge of our time, is that a lot of the things that we thought we knew, we're getting better. We're learning and we're understanding, and we have to unlearn, some of the habits that we had in the past. Okay, so if you want to learn about some of the things that we've been doing in that you can use the QR code. We have got a little report that talks to some of the stories where we have been able to make some really good gains in things like cement and aluminium. There are advances, and most of the suppliers are really leaning into this. These are all the people that are on the Meckler table with us as well, so if you're not in that tent, I highly recommend it. And just the last thing I wanted to touch on, and one of the other challenges that we've had, of anybody who's played in this space, embodied carbon and scope 3 generally are very vague terms. In the greenhouse gas protocol, they're not very well defined deliberately, because everybody's scope 3 is a little bit different, so it has to be contextualised. So we are worried about there being 20 different versions of defining this in the market, and so we've dropped a little gift into the industry to start the conversation around having a more consistent way of considering embodied carbon in the context of our work. We call it our Scope 3 protocol. So we did this torturous process where some people in our team looked at 22 different, company guidelines related to the greenhouse gas protocol, and we looked at 68 different disclosures, and then there are a bunch of subcategories. We went through and worked out which ones do we think are relevant for our sector, and we've suggested here's what you could be and should be considering within your boundary. And we have made that free. It's on our website. We want people to use it. We want people to tell us what they think is right or wrong about it so that we can collectively, come to something that we can all use and establish. And so these are the sorts of things that we have to report underneath that. So there's a little bit of a start off to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Look, in the interest of time, I'll ask people to hold questions until all of the presenters have had a crack, and then we'll bring a wider conversation. So I'm going to turn straight to our next presenter, Julia Halioua, from the Footprint Company, who's going to build on some of the material Anne's presented and talk about the next stage in the process, residential construction. Julia.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and to follow up on what I just presented, and thank you very much for the Scope 3 guidance. I think this is a true gift to the industry, indeed. So I will zoom in a bit more into the residential sector, but before I start, I will briefly talk about the Footprint Company. So we do provide services on carbon emission, and more specifically around embodied carbon. So if you want to learn more about it, feel free to reach out. So I will talk about the size of the challenge and what are the targets that we need to achieve to meet the Paris agreements, and how much are we talking about in terms of carbon emission in the residential sectors. What are the challenges and opportunities, and finally talking through practical solutions. But there are a lot of suggestions that have been made today already, so I will progress a bit on that. So in 2015, a lot of countries gathered in Paris. I wasn't there at the time. But they agreed on reducing the climate change impact to 1.5 degree increase, and that means reducing carbon emission by 50% of a 50% reduction of carbon reduction by 2050. There are industry groups such as the World Green Building Council and the Green Building Council Australia that have translated it and articulated that a 40% reduction target is recommended in embodied carbon for Australia and other countries around the world as well. Just to give a bit of a sense of the scale, the residential sector is about 30% of the construction value that include every building and infrastructure in Australia, so it is very large, and they give a bit of a hint about how big is the challenge and why we should be looking at the residential sector as well, and not just the non-residential building and infrastructure. The other things to note as well is that as we are improving the building energy efficiency in the residential sector, we are sometimes adding more material, such as moving from single glazing to double glazing or adding additional insulation. And while this provides a lot of value in terms of comfort or acoustic and cost of living, it does also has a side effect of adding embodied carbon. So it is quite important to look at embodied carbon along energy efficiency to make sure that we can also deliver as much carbon reduction as possible. All right, so if we follow the Paris Agreement, for every single project or master plan or residential development that you have, we need to build the same things with the same specification, but by reducing embodied carbon emission by half. So it is a very big challenge. So when we look at the upfront carbon emission for dwellings, the first chart, the one that is on the right. Sorry, I'm not great with right and left. So the smallest one. It is for Class 1A, so this would be for detached homes. And the chart is in tons of CO2, in kilograms of CO2 per NLA, so it is per area ratio. So it is smaller for homes than for apartments, but we need to keep in mind, the main reason is because there is a lot more foundation, underground car park, and so on in apartment buildings, and structural elements. But we need to be mindful as well that apartments tend to be a bit smaller than homes, so it does balance up the carbon emission between the two types of dwellings. The specificity of homes, the chart is appearing a bit differently. The specificity of homes is that there is a lot of stuff in a home. It's not like we deliver a cold shell apartment building, office building, where a lot of the emissions are in the structure and in the facade. For homes, there is a wide diversity of emissions. And if you look at the envelope plus the structure, it's only 40%. Then all the stuff inside is another 35%. So it is important to start looking at homes. It is possible to start by looking at the structure and the facade because it's what people are most familiar with. And there is also less material involved in terms of number of elements. But it is good to keep in mind that there is also a lot of emission from what's inside, including the building services. And it's a bit similar for apartments, but as we can see, the structure in the facade is much bigger. And the internal wall will be a bit smaller. So I did some rough estimation based on the footprint benchmark for homes and apartments, and also that we have about 200,000 new dwellings built each year, and that comes up at about 20 million tons of CO2 per year just for upfront embodied carbon in residential. So to put it into perspective, that's about 6.5 million cars driven per year, 4 million home energy use for 1 year, and also 1 billion in AHURI. So it would be very expensive to offset. I tried to look at how big the forest would need to be as well, but I got a bit into a loophole. Just to highlight as well, on townhomes, for example, the upfront embodied carbon is 25% of carbon emission across the life cycle of the home. And as the home are becoming more energy efficient, and more importantly, as a grid decarbonize, this portion is becoming bigger and bigger, and it will become bigger quickly. So it's a very meaningful and topical element that needs to be addressed alongside other building typology. So why are we not doing more about it at the moment? What are the challenges that the industry is facing? The first one is measuring. So there are different reasons why measuring can be challenging. This is a chart that was produced by Mekla. There are different benchmarks that exist, and each of them have a slightly different coverage and metrics that they use, which make them really hard to compare. It doesn't need to stop you from measuring embodied carbon. I think what's important is that you start with a methodology and you just acknowledge clearly what is included, what isn't, and the level of coverage. And then you can either choose to add more with time or just make sure that whatever you're comparing with, it remains consistent. And the second one is that in the residential sector, especially for homes and low-density dwellings, there may not be a lot of data available to do a life cycle assessment and measure embodied carbon. So a bill of quantity or a cost plan may not be as detailed or available, and that will definitely, that may create some challenges to measure embodied carbon, but also assess any reductions that the project want to do in terms of circular economy or other initiatives. Shouldn't stop you either. But I think it's important to acknowledge it and be able to extract information from what is available. So it's possible to extract quantities, for example, of drawings or things like that. The next one, and George touched on it this morning as well, Rohit touched on it this morning as well, is that residential buildings are a bit missed from a lot of the frameworks that exist already around sustainability and circularity and embodied carbon. So for example, Green Building Council Australia, which has been really leading sustainability for buildings in this country, would cover apartments with Green Star building, but it's not widely used for apartments. And for homes, the Green Star Home scheme doesn't include embodied carbon at the moment. There might be some changes with Green Star communities that is coming and incorporating it, but similarly, it's not widely used and it's only on master plan project. NABER's embodied carbon, that is going to be amazing tool that is going to be used by planner as well to drive the measurement and reduction of embodied carbon on other type of asset class, will not cover residential. And then recently Basics in New South Wales with new SEP has released a material index. So this is the first one that is really starting to address embodied carbon. It does only look at portion of the building elements, including the all the envelope and the structure, but it is a bit limited in the interior elements. But it is a really good way to start to measure and then start collecting data, so that and also educate people in the industry on embodied carbon. So I'm hoping other states will follow up as well. And finally, NADER, which is with the National Construction Code, only addresses energy use. It doesn't address embodied carbon at the moment. So there is a bit of a gap in here, which make it a bit more difficult. And there is also not a lot of drivers for residential developers to actually measure and reduce embodied carbon. And the last one is education. A lot of people in the residential sector are not across embodied carbon or what they can do to reduce it. They have an interest, but they might not be as sophisticated as large developers that we see in other sectors. Similarly, homeowners, they may not know about embodied carbon, and I would completely understand. And they may choose to do a knockdown and rebuild a beautiful home for their family, but they wouldn't really understand the implication, except for cost. So what can we do about it? So the first one that was highlighted before as well is that it's critical to look at it at early stage, even if there is a limitation in the data that is available at the time. And it's about planning how we can build less in the first place, how we can have a better use or repurpose existing building or refurbishment, or how we can have a better use of the existing space that exists. And that can only be done very early on. If you arrive at the end of the project and it's about switching normal concrete for Portland cement for green concrete, you wouldn't be able to achieve as much reduction. And just to keep in mind that we need to achieve 40% by 2030, and we are already in 2024. So with the scale of the challenge, I think we need to really start looking at it at early stage. Next one is following the circular economy hierarchy and using some of the strategies that were already mentioned before, such as building smaller homes. It's probably not the most popular one, but it's a very efficient one, and this one will also reduce the cost of construction. Providing flexibility in the space to allow for upsizing or downsizing, or making it easier for people to downsize when they don't need such a big home. Refurbishment of existing dwelling. So, when we see that the envelope and the structure is about 45%, you can save 45% easily by doing a refurbishment. Reuse of existing material, creating shared space. So this is more common in apartments, although it has been lost a bit. Can we have like shared space to cater for when we invite people and we have guests over, so that we don't need such a big apartment? Can we have a shared garden? Can we have a shared laundry? That one is a bit more tricky, but do we all need a laundry room? And finally, we can also look at material passport. It would be quite cool if we could get a digital version of our home with a drawing, and that will also tell us, what has been used for the tile that I have in my kitchen, so that if I have a crack, I can actually change it instead of having to redo the whole thing. Same for the paint. Always good to know, which color you have. And that would also give you a stronger sense of ownership because you actually know what you own. Sorry, it's not switching. And finally, the last step, which is the one that is most commonly addressed at the moment, is changing materials. So looking at what are the biggest source of emission, so structure foundation, facade glazing, building services, and looking at how I can either through efficient design, using less, using low carbon assemblies, so changing the type of buildup that we have, or using low carbon materials. And this is just an example for windows, but we typically have aluminum frame windows, but you can change to low aluminum. That would give you a lot of reduction, or you can switch to PVC as well. This one is lower in embodied carbon. So there are a lot of options that exist already that are not always more expensive, that can already be implemented practically on project. All right. So just to summarize, the upfront carbon or in residential sector are very large, and they will grow over time in terms of the proportion of residential sector carbon emission overall. The opportunities to support the industry, there are opportunities via education and creating frameworks and regulation as well, because there is little incentive at the moment that exists to reduce upfront carbon. It's not always more expensive. Like if you do it from the beginning, you can even save costs by reducing carbon emission, because by definition, you're going to use less material and resources. Circular economy will definitely help, especially when we have such a high target and such a short timeline. And finally, it's important to note that there are also a lot of co-benefits. For example, the shared space deliver also social value and connection between neighbors. It could reduce cost, and it could support the development of innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to keep us moving now because we're a little behind time, but I'll now turn to Cathy Inglis to drill down into the building materials and at a very practical level. What are we talking about? Cathy.
Thank you. So I'll get a bit more specifics about the actual materials and what we're going to build with. And we heard this morning about the cost impact on building materials and how that hit the market. So specifically, I'm from the brick, concrete, masonry, roof tile industry, so I will focus on that part of it. And a lot of the discussion on embodied carbon in buildings focuses around the big elements and the big carbon contributors, which is concrete, steel, aluminium, and glass. The other materials are all a lot lower in comparison, and that's often because of their contribution to the amount of the materials in the building as well. So looking at how there's low embodied carbon, but through the whole building cycle, the capacity of the building materials that we need and the capability to supply them, and what challenges this means for the manufacturing industry in Australia. So the building life cycle, we saw this in Anne's before, but when we talk about actually making the materials, we're down in that A1 to A3 portion right at the front in the product stage, and that's the contribution. So a manufacturer's embodied carbon that comes into that A1 to A3 becomes someone like Anne's Scope 3 emissions. So manufacturers try to get our Scope 1 and 2 down so that that's other people's lower Scope 3 emissions during the construction phase and through the life of the building. So the life cycle embodied carbon is really important, and I know we're starting to measure with BASIX the upfront embodied carbon in buildings. Neighbours is bringing it in before the end of the year. And that's a good starting point, but we do need to look at over the whole life cycle, because looking at just the upfront part is a portion of it, and you don't want to have a perverse outcome by building buildings that have lower carbon but have a shorter life cycle because they don't last as long, they're not as durable, they're not as resilient. And this morning it was said, if we can make buildings last twice as long, we save that 45% carbon. So we need to consider the durability and resilience of materials and their life of them. And you've got embodied carbon in that upfront build, but you've also got embodied carbon in the use stage, which is your maintenance of those materials, and then you've obviously got embodied carbon at end of life. Then on top of that, you've got your operational carbon as well. So if we look at this in the circular economy story, when you look at that from a manufacturing point of view, you have your resource, you have your manufacturing, your use stage and your end of use. Now I'm going to go through each of these in example and just look specifically about how bricks and masonry fit into this circular part of the economy. So as a resource, clay is one of the most abundant materials in the world. It's sourced locally, it's not transported a long way. All the factories in Australia are local and they're located on clay quarries, so there's not a lot of transported materials. Through the manufacturing phase, there's a lot of other waste materials that can go into making bricks. Everyone would be surprised. We can put a lot of stuff into bricks. But one of the biggest impediments of us doing that and introducing circular economy, so reducing other people's waste and diverting it from landfill, is the EPA. And I'm very critical of the EPA on many levels because they're actually preventing manufacturers decarbonising. And I'm having lots of discussions with them about that. But within the process in manufacturing, in the plants, any waste that's generated is incorporated straight back in. Any crushed bricks and crushed materials can go into the bricks, and that's all fine because that's all collected on site. But because manufacturers have manufacturing licences, we don't have waste licences. So you're not allowed to accept someone else's waste unless you go through years and years of arguments with the EPA to be able to bring someone else's waste onto your site. So there's many things that you can add and happen, and various plants around the country have got little bits happening. We've got coal washings going into bricks. We've got shredded timber and waste pallets. There's a research project going on in Sydney at the moment that's looking to use organic waste to repurpose that into the brick manufacture next door, because the tip's located next door to the brick manufacturing. It's been going on for 2 years. We have still not got permission from the EPA to do a trial for one day in a plant. So when you look at that, you get to the point where manufacturers go, I'm just going to give up. Like, seriously, do you want us to do anything at all? Do you want us to decarbonise? And that would not only reduce the energy to fire the bricks, it would also reduce the waste to landfill, which means that's generating methane gases, which is 28 times the carbon footprint. So it has a really good story, but you're just not allowed to do it. So there's also a lot of other things happening in manufacturing: heat being recycled, renewable energy being used, biofuels, so using biogas from landfill sites. There's a plant in Australia that's fired purely on waste biomass. So there's lots of things happening in the manufacturing industry that are actually reducing the carbon footprint significantly of building products. When we look through the use stage, and it's been talked about a lot today, about design is one of the main things and how you reduce the carbon and improve the circularity. You design for longevity. We also need to, even though the grid's decarbonising, we still need to look at the energy used over the operating life of those homes and build energy efficient homes. Design for resilience and design for low maintenance. And through those phases, there's a lot of research going on in the industry at the moment to look at thermal performance of houses, designing houses for future climate scenarios and looking at the climate in 20, 30, 40 years' time. We're building houses now, we want them to last longer. They're going to be here in 40 or 50 years. So we need to design them for what's happening in the future as well. And finally, at end of use stage, and bricks, masonry, roof tiles have a good story. Bricks are one of the few materials you can actually reuse with their full structural properties intact. So there's lots of great examples, and just to give you one, when you reuse them, so that's your upcycling. We pull them down, we clean them off, reuse them. There's about 5 brick recycling yards in Sydney. The oldest one is the Brick Pit. That's been going since 1975, and since then they've recycled 60 million bricks. So you take the average house has about 8,000, 9,000 bricks, depending on the size of it. That's an awful lot of bricks recycled. But the other thing is, when do you do it? At what point of that building's life? I've got a research project going at the moment because the old bricks are much easier to recycle with the lime mortars on them. They're easy to clean off. The newer bricks, once cement came into use and we learned we needed more durable mortars to cope with coastal and weather conditions and everything else, they're harder to remove. But we're working on a project combined with RMIT and Newcastle Uni called Not So Sticky Mortar to try and work out how we can get mortar off bricks easier so they can be repurposed even though they're built with cement mortars. So there's a lot of research happening in the industry to improve this circularity of products in the market. And most industries are doing the same thing. So I think this is an opportunity for the industry to lean into manufacturing in Australia as well. What's happening here and how we can actually grow this part of the market more and use products that last a long time, they're durable, and they can actually be reused at the end of their life.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cathy. Fantastic. So now I'll invite Carrie Hamilton to come and talk about the next stage, about occupancy and that stage of housing's life cycle, and to consider aspects of design of homes and communities in order to encourage occupants to adopt low carbon lifestyles. Carrie.
Thanks very much to Michael. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I really appreciate Uncle Alan's welcome before to Gadigal land, because really what we're trying to do today as we learn circular economy is learn Indigenous wisdom. Okay, so I really want to honor that. So I'm so excited to be here. My work in the last couple of years has been trying to bring circular economy thinking to social and affordable housing. So this is a fantastic conference, and I really commend AHURI. And we've heard a couple things today about embodied carbon and operating carbon. I'd like to present circular economy hubs to you. So, we started out, and we've been talking through this wonderful session about the design and construction phase and the embodying carbon. We've talked about the operating phase and how we will try to get gas out of our buildings. Victoria has gotten all the gas out of all new build and refurb, so we'll be cooking without gas, induction, pretty soon. And I'd like to talk, as Michael mentioned, about the habitation phase, what I'm calling the habitation phase, behavioral circular economy, how people live in the buildings. So we've talked about the stuff in the buildings. So I'd like to talk about how the upfront design and inclusion of circularity can encourage behavior change in the 40, 50, and onwards, hopefully, years that people will be in the housing and reduce their waste and emissions. So this is, this session is the building capability and capacity in Resi. So this is to build the capacity of the future people who will live in the housing. And so we will do this through circular economy hubs. Where's my next slide? There it is. So my thesis is, like, in the broader circular economy, that this clever design at the front of an apartment block or a subdivision can reduce waste and emissions later on, saving the residents unnecessary vehicle trips or buying stuff that's been shipped to Australia they don't need to be buying, and also building community at the same time. Okay, so this means setting aside some space in the design phase for this to occur, and I'll show you exactly what this means. So hubs, I actually might refer back to Lisa, our first speaker today, talked about the ministerial advisory committee that she's on and their interim report. So the chair, John Thwaite, said in that report, the circular economy is essential to reaching net zero, with 70% of our carbon emissions associated with the way we make and use things. So there's the house, but what about the things inside? And Ralph's talked about doubling the life of housing. What about doubling the life of the stuff that you buy and not buying more stuff? Sharing the things, extending their lives to keep them in use. So first I'll show you an example, some good photos of a hub in action. I'll show you what recent Australian work is here in New South Wales. And then finally I'll link this concept to social and affordable housing, my passion. A win-win for reducing cost for residents. So this is me walking around Copenhagen a few years ago, and I was walking in a new build area, Nordhavn, which is North Harbour, a lot of mid high-rise apartment buildings, and I saw this. What is a Nergenbrugstation? Any Danish speakers here? No. Google Translate. It is recycling station. And then there was a little sign on it, and I was like, what? This is open to the community. I can walk right into this. So community linkages. The sign translates to, you can leave things here that you don't use anymore in exchange for others to enjoy, even outside of opening hours. Sincerely, the reuse advisor. So that's what that sign in Danish says. So I was intrigued. I walked right in. And so this is what I found. So this is taking up the space of about 10 to 12 parking spots. Okay, so you give up that amenity for this amenity. This is a recycling station around the outside for hard to recycle items. And then on the inside, I went further. And we found a swap shelf. Okay, so this is everyone, not just who lives in that apartment building, but the entire community can leave things for others. No exchange of money. You can just leave things there, take things. I found out later in doing some research, this is flexible space for classes in repair. Things can be left that need modest repairs to keep them in life and keep them in use and keep them in circulation. And all of the shelving you see is on wheels. That could be wheeled outside. So not only is this open to the entire community, it is flexible and porous. So here's the vision for you to take from this example. And I hate that we always look at overseas examples. I apologize, but I was just walking by. And so what if it was a condition of development assessment for your multifamily building or your subdivision that you had to set aside some space for circular economy behaviors, okay? Space out of the rain. Council cleanup enables poor choices and poor stewardship of things we buy. It's got to be out of the rain, dignified, with a light touch curation like this. So let's move to what's happening here in Australia. I have a few take-home things for you to read over the weekend. There's a few QR codes coming up. We had a wonderful Too Good to Waste circular economy policy that was published in 2019. This was a follow-up policy in 2021. The New South Wales Framework's Waste and Sustainable Materials, the second core circular economy policy is what I'm talking about, is keep products and materials in use. Okay, so that was 2019, this is 2021. Lisa mentioned this morning. This is the Circular Economy Community Hubs work that was published in 2022. New South Wales Circular was Lisa's previous organization that was funded out of the Office of the Chief Scientist, New South Wales. She has now converted this into Australian Circular. So she mentioned this very briefly this morning. I served on an advisory group to the development of this work through 2021. And so this was developed with UTS's Design Innovation Research Center and Good for the Hood and advisory, but it's really Lisa's, Circular Economy, Circular Australia publication. So there was a lot of case studies collected there. There was a lot of incorporation of Indigenous wisdom through that working group. I was really pleased, to be involved with. And so the call to action is this, out of this work. Community hubs are essential to providing citizens with the services they need to waste less. We don't know how to do this. We need to have facilitation. We need to know how to keep resources in use, how to regenerate nature. Community hubs are global best practice to engage people, citizens, with the circular economy. This is after the house is built and we're all living in it. And there are many types of hubs with similar characteristics, but they need to be locally driven and reflect the local economy. So this is tiny, but I know you've scanned the QR code, and so these are some concepts for the hubs. There's a lot of variety, and there's a lot of options here from mobile hubs. These are kit of parts basically for how circular economy hubs can be normalized, how these behaviors can be normalized in our communities and for us. So I believe the hubs are really how the circular economy is brought to life, and how a lot of our personally generated emissions can be removed. And I'm really talking about supply chain disruption. When you buy some household good that breaks, it's how do you fix it? Too hard basket is calling. The council cleanup is enabling. It is difficult to figure out how to fix this. It is too easy to drive to the shopping center, emissions, unless you have an EV, and you are buying something that was shipped to Australia from overseas, most likely. It's too easy right now. So, Roger talked about, kind of like thinking about how we value things, taking investment, and I bought my first sock darning thing, the wooden thing that you put. I actually bought one last year. So I didn't know how to do it, now I do. So this is, the utilization rates that Roger was talking about. It's not just the built environment. It's your stuff, and community hubs can help. So here's one I prepared earlier. So these are hubs that I run in my local community here in Sydney. I've done this quarterly a few times in the last couple of years. We call it the Re-Fest, reuse and repair. We don't say recycling. Recycling is actually very, very low on the waste hierarchy. That's your last resort if you've tried everything else, okay? Recycling is a furphy. I didn't say that. And I said that. And so we set this up, to, it's different every time. Who's interested in running a bike repair? We always have a repair cafe. I run the Trendy Mending, teaching people how to repair clothes. We have terrible issues with textile waste in Australia. And that's been called out by the Minister Plibersek. And then I run this Tupperware Tinder. What if every community, when you have those mismatched lids and containers in your drawer, what if we all got together and threw them in a paddle pool that I found on the side of the road, and we matched? People find matches. You can disinfect these things. You can keep them in use. People have been throwing them out. Okay, so this can happen, but I want to make the point about distributed circularity. The minute you're driving across LGAs to take advantage of a place to donate something or rehome something or fix something, that's not as good as the hyperlocal sharing, production, consumption of goods that reduces emissions. So this has got to be hyperlocal, so distributed circular economy in our living communities. I just also have to emphasize, so we just do this in the local scout hall. I have to pack it up, and when we set it up, my colleagues and I, we set it up again every time we do it. So this is why I'm promoting to you setting aside space during the design phase for this behavioral circular economy. So I'd like to talk about, my passion, which is, linking this to social and affordable housing communities. In one sense, to future-proof them, but also to link them better into the communities, the broader communities. I want broader communities to see social and affordable housing communities as resources, as clever people who can solve your too hard basket. John Thwaites, who's the chair of the Circular Economy Ministerial Group, also said, the circular economy is a market opportunity with potential to create new jobs and economic growth for Australia. So these are some photos of Mission Australia Housing's Common Ground project in Camperdown. This is on the same street that Albo grew up on. He always says, I grew up in social housing. He did, and it's on the same street as the Common Ground project. During COVID, this project, which has really innovative property and tenancy management, not only did they have the rooftop garden and everything, but they have a commercial kitchen in the ground floor where they taught people how to prepare those things into meals. Not just residents, the broader community, people who are experiencing food insecurity. There's the Addison Road food pantry there, which is circular because it's working with donated surplus stock, and it works on a point system. I'm sorry, it's very difficult to read the blackboard there. This is open to the community. This is an example where a social and affordable housing community project can actually help the broader community, those experiencing some needs outside. So this is my vision, that social and affordable housing communities who are about to be social affordable housing nonprofits, community housing providers, are about to be building quite a bit. So the first round of the Housing Australia Future Fund just closed for 8,000 dwellings, and it was 3 times oversubscribed. There may be more. The National Cabinet's Housing Accord, that's 1.2 million dwellings that are coming online. Not all affordable, many are. But I'd really encourage everyone in this room who is engaged in that project to think about incorporating these hub concepts, some space where this can flourish. I also got to go to a conference when I was in Europe, and I wandered into the Danish example of a peak body called Reuse, which was RREUSE. It's Reuse Recycling European Union Social Enterprises. The obligatory address by the minister at the beginning of that was not the environment minister, as you'd expect. It was the employment minister. So we can expose ourselves to greater funding by understanding the connections to employment and training from the reuse and repair that the circular economy and what can happen at these hubs might represent for some of our customers, our colleagues, and our neighbors who live in social and community housing. And just finally, I just want to give a plug for some other government innovations. Since working in the Australian housing sector and working with AHURI for many years, I've recently joined the New South Wales Department of Energy, Climate Change and Sustainability. I don't speak on behalf of the government, of course, but I want to reassure you that so much good is happening. And this is a report on circular design guidelines for the built environment that I would really commend to you. And then the $175 million in social housing energy performance initiative, SHEPI. It's always got to have a great initiative. The EPA is funding circular economy councils workshops. If there's any LGAs who's interested, that's in early June. Waste guide for councils and housing providers is coming out of the EPA. National Framework for Disclosure of Residential Energy Efficiency Information. That's what we need. The star rating for the homes. Maybe if you couldn't get your negative gearing unless you rated a certain, I didn't say that. I totally said that. You know, if you're not able to get your negative gearing, unless you meet a certain. So that's it for me, but I really appreciate the chance to promote this. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. If nothing else, I think this will proliferate Tupperware tenders across the country.
First Baronia Scout Hall. Yeah.
Breaching two
June
trademarks
2nd.
at once, but what a great idea. Perhaps before we'll get microphones around to people, so if you can get your hands up now, we'll get a microphone to you in a moment. But while you're percolating your questions, I might just turn to the panel and I guess, on one hand, I heard from each of you on the role of procurement, the role of government policy in setting an agenda, but then also all of you giving examples of things where you're not waiting for that and getting on with it. To what extent does government procurement policy or development approvals or those sorts of mechanisms drive the changes we need to make, or do we just get on with it anyway? And I'm going to go to you first.
Both. So for a long time, waiting for government was a very long wait. So it was imperative that we got on with it, but we won't get where we need to be fast enough without government intervention. I'm a firm believer in that in terms of leveling the playing field. So if you look at the sorts of ambitions that our company has set around carbon, you can see the same in most of our peers, something similar, not all identical, but you go down a few layers, few tiers, and you'll see nothing. And this is where government policy and procurement policy is really critical to level the playing field, to make it non-competitive, that it's not a choice of whether or not you bring a low embodied carbon solution to the table. It's a ticket to play. And that I think is absolutely fundamental to getting the scale of change that we need, to having the scale of demand that we need so that supply chain, et cetera, can reposition themselves knowing that there's buyers in the market. So I'm really excited by what I'm seeing with, Infrastructure New South Wales have just brought out a decarbonisation policy that will affect all of their agencies. Tanya Plibersek brought out, a sustainable procurement policy. These things are fundamental to taking, just like helping human beings make decisions for the long term. Otherwise, we will continue to make it for the short term unless you're in the tier that you've got investors and things who are holding you to account. And so for all the players that don't have that, I think policy plays a huge role.
Questions from the floor? I know it's the after lunch session, it's always a little hard. We've got a couple over this way. Perhaps starting in the yellow.
So when we talk about definitions for like net zero or absolute zero as was defined, there's a lot of these terminologies that are going around and can cause a lot of confusions. Do you think that the government or a broader framework should be established so that the definitions are well established and which can be then adapted for different contexts? Is there something that should be done first?
So there's a taxonomy, it's the ASFI help me with the acronym. It's the finance guys.
The finance guys are doing it.
Yeah, Australian Sustainable
Someone-
Finance
someone-
Institute,
yeah.
something like that. That have been asked to pull together taxonomy around those terms, and also greenwashing legislation means that you have to define your terms. So you'll see people now starting to actually footprint what do they mean when they say net zero or absolute zero, which is really important because often the boundaries can be quite different between it. So you're right, it can be very confusing. Sorry, Halioua, you were going to add to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree that it's coming from the finance side or setting a strong framework for how things can be labelled.
They've been commissioned by the government to come up with a taxonomy position statement, which will be interesting.
Good.
Roger might know more. He's nodding his head at me. ASFI, is that right?
Yeah.
Taxonomies are being developed across multiple sectors, looking at carbon climate first, but then it's going to start looking at nature.
Nature positive.
As well. So there's a whole process going on. But in terms of the mandatory disclosure and the standardisation of what that looks like, from the finance side that's coming down, but the regulators are doing it different. So hopefully they come together.
We'll get it soon.
Terrific.
I think that's incredibly important. I've worked in unlocking superfund investment in affordable and social housing and just defining what are the different affordability levels. That's why it's so important to have apples to apples when we talk about climate and how we understand how we, there's a tremendous importance in verifying offsets, of course, to make sure that's genuine when it's unavoidable. That's the only way to mitigate emissions. But I don't know if any of that is going to translate to the individual. I think it's very important as well as we get the taxonomy straight for certainty of investment and apples to apples, but we also get what does this mean to me? How many kilowatts am I using in my house? And it's very, very difficult. It needs to be explained also on a different level, a taxonomy that's more of a citizen's taxonomy as well. So when my hot water heater breaks, I will buy a heat pump that will cost this much, but it will be worth it in less time than before I move. When this breaks, I will do that, and the EV makes sense because this and it's very tricky. You can be an early adopter and not even feel in control of the terminology. And so, net zero, 50% by, so we've legislated we'll be at 70% of 2005 emission level reduction by 2035. Now, those are so many numbers you've already tuned out. Those are important, brave commitments that are in legislation in this state, but they're very, very hard to embody as a citizen. So, I think 2 layers of taxonomy is the point I'd like to make.
Yeah, just to add to this, I feel that in the residential sector, especially, there is a little demand for embodied carbon, but also circular economy. And the main reason is people what their priority would be the location, the price, how many bedrooms it has. Maybe energy efficiency might play if people are interested into environment. But if we start talking about embodied carbon, then home buyer will be completely lost. And there is no driver in terms of regulation either. So the only driver that exists at the moment is actually coming from the finance system, where people have to start looking and reporting on their scope 3. But it's really hard to kind of make it relatable for the people and explaining to them, what is in the material, what they should be reusing them, what is the value for them, and so on.
Which again is where policy comes in again, because at a local council level, if there's an expectation or a requirement, like they've you have to do water tanks and PV, etc., and now starting to finally look into embodied carbon materials. Sometimes we need to be told what to do, unfortunately.
There's another question over here.
John from Shelter, thank you very much for the panel and for the information. I hadn't really heard that much and known that much, and I apologise, I should, about the circular economy. One thing we're struggling with at the moment is density, and density done well. I'm interested to see, because we often just hear, and I think of some of the slides today have done this, housing as either being single detached cottages or, 23-metre buildings. Is there a sweet spot with a design typology that we could encourage now, which is the terraces, the townhouses, the villas, that people like Elizabeth Farrelly and others say, we need 30 more Paddingtons, 30 more Surrey Hillses. That's what we need. I'm thinking that the circular economy argument is really strong in that direction, so anyone who's got any comment?
Well, the embodied carbon
Yeah.
is very strong in that because the tall, thin building is actually not fantastic from an embodied carbon perspective because you've got so much facade and you've got so much structure having to hold it up. So, if the full deck of that Atelier 10 deck that I presented there talks to some of that sort of medium density, having a per square metre a much better outcome. Now that's an embodied carbon outcome. I mean, the best outcome is reusing what you've already got, and so that's not so much a density piece because we've got lots of suburbs that don't have density. So wherever we're increasing density, we are using resources that are finite and etc. But yes, if you've got to build new, there probably is a sweet spot. That's a really interesting concept to play in.
But those like 3 to 4 story sort of walk up, the old traditional 3 to 4 story walk up, and the building commissioner here's got that 6 story sort of concept going that he's trying to sweet spot for being below that level where the concrete frame suddenly gets so big that it doesn't stack up to do a concrete frame structure up to that type. So it's about the building, and those sort of structures can be lower carbon because they don't have that massive.
They can be timber.
Timber structures, load bearing masonry. They can be other things that don't have that same carbon footprint.
Yeah. I also feel that there is a bit of shift between a home or apartment, and people tend to have preference for homes. So to create attractivity for it, it's important to provide, same level of facilities and so on. So it's, shared gardens on the roof or at lower level. For example, having a dedicated space that can be booked so that people can invite people. I mean, there is a lot of things that can be done to make, by dedicating space for other uses, that can help people to accept living in smaller apartments or, smaller dwelling in general.
There's some great examples of density done well, of course, in Scandinavia, and similar to the sort of thing that I think you're leaning to. The best one that I'd seen had, I think they were like 3 or 4 stories. They were apartments. They each had quite a large, deep balcony, so that if you had little kids and you needed to supervise them while you're making, lunch, they could be outside, but in your site. But they all looked onto a shared garden, and the shared garden was quite enormous, and it had a playground in it, and it had a greenhouse and veggie patches and space to kick the footy, and every apartment could see their family, that whatever that was in there, but they also were connected by a staircase. So if they wanted to, hang out with each other, I don't know how it would work if you hated your neighbours, but it was. But I actually looked at that and went, oh, that's density done well. Like that density would build community, would build, like togetherness. There's a shared economy thing that's happening there, and they're still connected to nature and to the outside. So. I'm desperately hoping that there will be some sort of planning kind of metamorphosis in Australia for the decent density concept to come. I'm not confident, but that's where we could look.
The Nightingale project.
Nightingale.
And they've got even shared laundry. Someone mentioned that before. They've even got shared laundries and things. So there's a lot of shared stuff to decarbonise that and to have the quite small apartments, but they all have access to shared facilities, so each individual unit is smaller to make them more affordable. Very similar, concept.
And I might just add, how much of your dwelling are you using to store stuff? Stuff that may not be in use, you just don't know how to get rid of it, how to rehome it, how to pass it on, how to fix it. And so, that space is wasted embodied carbon. And so if that stuff could be rehomed very quickly and efficiently, you just wouldn't have to store all that stuff, and you would save on your floor plate.
That's true.
Thank you, John.
Ralph.
Actually, if you don't mind, I was just going to add a comment in here. I really like this whole conversation because I think that what we're talking about is not just optimising the density of the dwelling, but at the utilisation of that space. And that's what's going to bring in what I'd call, for want of a better term, locational efficiency. So what happens beyond the dwelling, and therefore what causes mobility, what causes households to have to move outside the dwelling for various different things, and the distances that they travel. And I think they're the kind of scope 3 emissions of the dwelling, if you like, to use a kind of contrived term. And they do need to eventually be part of the circular economy, calculation, if you like, value calculation. So yeah, it was just a comment.
Thank you, Ralph. Any other questions from the audience at the moment? Oh, yes, Mike.
Thank you, and thank you for another fascinating panel discussion. It's been really thought-provoking. I chair a community housing provider, one of the largest in New South Wales, and arguably, one of the 10 largest in Australia. We're about to embark on a substantial building program, hopefully, depending on the outcome of various Commonwealth funding rounds. And there's a lot that we can do, and as a not-for-profit organisation and a registered charity, we're highly motivated by our social mission, which is principally house as many people as we can in as many places as quickly as we can. But in our construction program that will hopefully commence soon, where do we start with trying to bring in some elements of dealing with embodied carbon and the circular economy? What's the low-hanging fruit for an organisation like ours?
You start by asking companies like us to help you get it right. There are some low-hanging fruit items. So there are existing materials that are at price parity. So there are certain concrete mixes that you can use now that are lower embodied carbon for certain structural elements that are exactly the same price as other ones. So there are things like that you could start with straight away. The design pieces, so if you were looking at trying to reduce embodied carbon and looking at it in that design phase, you could save money, which is a really important agenda for the community housing, the social housing sector. And I know it's that whole, can we morally invest more in a building material potentially, and therefore have less to invest in providing the housing? It's the same for hospitals, etc. It's a really difficult battle. So I would say lean hard into design, because that's going to save you money as well, but you've got to put the topic on the table. So the first low-hanging fruit is to ask for it. And you don't have to commit. You can just say, look, can we actually explore what's possible here, and to allow some time in your program to explore alternatives so that you can make an informed decision about what's possible. And I think you might be pleasantly surprised about some of the things that could be achieved for community housing.
I was having a chat. Oh, excuse me. Were you about to? No. Oh, sorry. I was having a chat just before the break about how some of these choices that you'd make during the design phase and the specification of materials might be valued in the allocation of some of the new Commonwealth funding. And the thought is, look, this is only round one. We need some of these programs to become certain and to have track record. And then by round 8, doing this will be one of the assessment criteria.
Absolutely.
My other idea was that Roger should be on the assessment for the half, and he should be our sleeper agent. So that, so yeah, I'm going to call Housing Australia. But it's important to note that, we're early days on whether the effort that a community housing provider will make will be rewarded, either in the allocation of some of these federal and state incentives, or in the energy costs for your residents, or in the energy costs and operating costs for you. Early days, it depends on the long term. But yeah, look, we will, I would see, based on how the equivalent program went in the US, you know, by round maybe 6, 7, you know, this will start to be embodied in the regulatory through the assessment criteria. And then you'll have to. I would hope so. It has to be permanent first, you know. But yeah, so that's the long view.
To add to that, I think that there are a lot of opportunity at early stage when it's at planning and looking at whether or not it's possible to increase density in an existing building by building either up or wider or increasing the density within the dwelling. But there are opportunities as well throughout the design, and maybe when construction has started, it gets a bit more difficult. But while there is much more opportunity up front, it's still possible to investigate later if there are ongoing projects by just asking your project stakeholder or appointing specialists that will be able to provide advice on what can be done at the stage that the project is at. And the last element that is quite important is to measure the emissions so that you can really identify where are your biggest source of emission and where you should be focusing your efforts, because you may end up doing a lot of small things that wouldn't have a meaningful impact, where you can focus on like the biggest ones, and that's through measuring carbon emissions. And then when businesses get more sophisticated, measuring can become an iterative process so that they can check that they are actually achieving the reduction that they are targeting, and checking at the end as well that it has been delivered. So it's a way of checking that the targets have been provided both by the designer and the builders at the end of the project.
One final chance for questions from the floor. Do we have any further questions or for comments from the panel? Final word, anyone? I think we are a couple of minutes early, but only a few. And I'm noticing the energy in the room is starting to flag. The caffeine sources are out there, and the longer I talk, the sooner, the longer it takes for us to get to those. So perhaps we might break a couple of minutes early. We have about half an hour break before we'll turn to an international perspective to really round out the discussion today. So please join me in thanking the terrific panel.